Hello friends, today we are wrapping up the month that was in March and setting up for my reading in April. So we're going to start with my reading stats from March, then we're going to chat about the books that I read in March, and then at the end we'll talk a little bit about some of my reading and video plans for April. So I used the reading spreadsheet from Hardback Hoarder, and this month I logged 16 books, which is the same number that I logged in February, and I read a total of 4,137 pages. Of the 16 books, I DNF'd or did not finish 2 of them. There was actually a third book that I DNF'd this month, but I read like 30 pages, so I didn't bother putting it in my spreadsheet. My average star rating from March was a 3.5, which is the same that we had back in February. So again, you can see from the distribution here that the star rating that I gave out the most was 4. So it's not as if I'm hating everything that I'm reading. I'm either liking or enjoying most of it. But this is the second month in a row that I have not read a 5-star book. So I think it's official. I think I'm in a 5-star drought. I have not had a 5-star since back in January. And I actually had several 5 stars. How many 5 stars did I have in January? I had 5. 5 5-star books. January, I mean... I feel like I was catfished this year a little bit by January, thinking that I was going to have like the best reading year ever, and here I am 2 months later with still just 5 stars. 5 stars. So while my reading has not been terrible, I've read plenty of books that I've enjoyed. I am starting to feel that kind of lack of a book that I just love in my life at this point. So I am hoping that we can rectify that in April and come up with at least 1 or 2 5 stars. But for now, we've still got some more March stats to go through. So now taking a look at the genres that I read. Half of what I read was fantasy. My next largest category with 3 books was non-fiction, and then I've got 2 books that I classed as science fiction. Then I've got 1 each for contemporary, mystery, and romance. For formatting, the vast majority of the books that I read, 75%, were novels or standard books. I finished 2 graphic novels, I read 1 novella, and I classed 1 book as a tome because it was over 500 pages, but I didn't finish it, so... It doesn't really count. As for how I read my books, 11 of the books that I read this month were mixture reading, so I both listened and read. 4 books I read just physically, and 1 was just ebook. Mixed reading or immersion reading, however you want to call it, where I listen and read at the same time, or, you know, kind of move back and forth between the 2 within 1 book, is my favorite way to read. However, it usually accounts for somewhere between 40 and 60% of my reading every month. This time it accounted for nearly 70%. I do feel like I was relying more on audiobooks this month, and I wonder if that had a little bit to do with, like, not that I'm in a reading slump, but I think the fact that I haven't read any books that I would call new favorites that I was like so excited about has just kind of made me feel slightly less enthused and slightly less motivated to read. For the audience category of my books, this month definitely skewed heavily towards middle grade. Obviously it was middle grade month. I did a whole reading vlog. Most of the books that I read this month were middle grade. In fact, it was 62.5% of my reading, 10 books. Only 10? I thought I read 12. What's going on? Let me double check. Okay, I understand. I did read 12 books for that video, but one of them is that one that I DNF very early, so I didn't include. And one of them, like, we technically class as YA. It's a bit of a crossover book, which means 3 of the books that I read this month were young adult and 3 were adult. Lots of middle grade this month. Now, this next part is where I track the diversity of the books that I'm reading. Now, this is an imperfect way of tracking this, but even so, I am not happy with the numbers where this is at. 9 of the books that I read this month I class as meaningfully diverse in some way, and 9 of them were own voices. 0 were queer or LGBTQIA+. So that means that 56% of the books that I read were meaningfully diverse. To me, that is not where I want my reading to be. I definitely want it to be upwards of 70%, preferably much higher than that. So 56% like is just... I'm not happy with that number, and I'm not happy having read no queer books in March. I think obviously queerness is something that is not explored as extensively in the middle grade category. It's definitely there. You can find books, but it's not as prevalent as, say, in YA, for example. And I think generally speaking, I was definitely gravitating towards the books that I already had on my shelf and that had audiobooks, and that definitely does limit the scope, and it limits it even more when it comes to middle grade. There are not enough books from the middle grade category with audiobooks. So I think this is a little bit a result of how much middle grade I was reading, but also it's just on me and the middle grade books that I selected. So definitely something to keep in mind and an area I need to improve in April. In terms of where my books were coming from, 6 of them come from the US, 5 from Australia. I'm happy with that. I think last month I didn't read any books from Australia, so much better. Then we have 2 each from the United Kingdom and Canada and 1 from Palestine. Okay, so those are the stats for March. Now let's chat about the books themselves. So firstly, the 2 books that I DNF'd both came from my middle grade March video. The first was The Impossible Secrets of Lillian Velvet by Jaclyn Moriarty. This is a huge book that I didn't like, even though I managed to get all the way up to like 300 pages. I read a big chunk of this, and kind of on the opposite end of that spectrum, this itty bitty book I got halfway through. It's Thunderbird by Sonia Nimra. I'm not going to talk about the middle grade books in too much detail, especially the ones that I didn't like, because I've already done that in this video here. Definitely check that one out if you want to hear more of my thoughts, including on why I chose to DNF these 2 books. I also DNF'd one other book, but like I said, I DNF'd it very early, so I didn't even bother putting it in my spreadsheet. I DNF'd Nimona. That's a much beloved graphic novel that I just wasn't getting hooked by. Again, check out this video if you want to hear more. In that same video, I had 4 books that I liked well enough but didn't kind of cross over into that love territory. So they are A Rover's Story, OK Witch, which is a graphic novel, Withering by Sea, this was probably my least favorite of this category, and Alebrijes. These are all books that didn't necessarily work for me 100%, but that I can definitely see an audience for, and I am happy to have read them so that I can recommend them and hand sell them at work. For the books that I really enjoyed from that video, I would say the graphic novel Things in the Basement. It was a very quick read because it's very light on text, but it's very atmospheric. The art was amazing. I liked it a lot. My number 4 favorite from that video would be The Lost Library. This is adorable. This is sweet. It's cute and cozy. It's a mystery fantasy story about the love of books, and a bunch of the chapters are narrated by a cute cat. So, I mean, you can't go wrong. Tiger Daughter by Rebecca Lim. This is one of those books that's kind of a crossover between middle grade and young adult, and we do stock it in the young adult category at my shop, which is why I have categorized it as young adult in my spreadsheet. But I did read it for middle grade March because I've been meaning to get to it, and it's recommended for ages 11 plus, which I certainly agree with myself, and I'm really glad that I finally got to it because I loved it. War 2 is billed as an Indigenous Blinky Bill meets Winnie the Pooh, and it's just as charming and adorable as it sounds. It's about a hairy-nosed wombat who falls in love with the sky. It's so charming. And then of course I finally got to The Wee Free Men by Terry Pratchett. This is my very first Terry Pratchett, my first entry into the Discworld series, and although it was not a 5-star obsessed love it, I really enjoyed it, and I do want to read more from Discworld. I think I'm just going to commit to the Tiffany Aching series, at least for now. Committing to the entirety of Discworld after just 1 book is a little bit too much for me. There's like 40 books in that series, isn't there? Whereas the Tiffany Aching sequence in particular, I think is 5 books. I really enjoyed the story, I really loved the characters, and I really enjoyed the humor. So I'm looking forward to more. One thing I did forget to do in my middle grade March reading vlog is to talk about the prompts for the challenge. So just quickly, let's see if I met all 5 prompts. I think I did. Okay, the first one is a 1-word title, and we've got Alebrijes, check. Number 2 is a debut. I think this was a debut graphic novel. Yes, this was a debut graphic novel, check. Number 3 is an immigration or refugee story, and I mean, Tiger Daughter I think is perfect for that. Number 4 is an animal on the cover. I mean, obviously we got War 2. He's such a cute little wombat, big check. And then number 5, a book you missed out on. And I would interpret that as, I think We Free Men would best fit that for me, because this is a book that I've been meaning to get to for the last few years. I've just been putting off, and I think it's one of the older books on this list too. It was published back in 2003, I think. Yeah, so 2003. So I'm late to the party, and I'm very happy I finally got to it. Nice, so I did. I achieved all of the prompts. Awesome. The other book that I read for that video is not a middle grade, and to be honest with you, it's more of an essay, but it does come in a published form, was Why You Should Read Children's Books Even Though You're So Old and Wise by Katherine Rundell. And I mean, the title of that one says it all. It's basically an essay where Katherine Rundell, an incredible middle grade author, tries to convince you, the reader, to be open to reading more middle grade and children's books in general. And it's just delightful. It's a celebration of children's literature, and I loved it, which is why I spoke about it and shared so many quotes from it at the beginning of that video. Okay, now switching gears entirely from middle grade, another book that I read this month that you already know about is Doppelganger by Naomi Klein. I ended up accidentally doing an entire reading vlog for this book, which I did not know I was going to do when I originally started this book for my reading books that Booktubers made me buy video. God, that was like a month ago now. And then I still didn't even know that I was going to make an entire video dedicated to this book when I started this video all about this book. I know this video feels a little bit weird in tone sometimes, and that is because when I sat down to first check in about, you know, reading halfway through this book, I thought I was just going to be filming like a casual week in my life kind of reading vlog, and I'd be reading several books throughout the week. But then I ended up still taking longer with this book than I thought and having way too many thoughts that I wanted to share about it. So it ended up being a video all on its own. And if you want to hear my thoughts, mostly my negative ones, you can watch this video. If you want to hear my positive thoughts that I was having for the first half of the book, which still remain relevant for the rest of it, you can check out my earlier video reading books that Booktubers made me buy. So overall, in case it's not obvious, at this point I have a complex range of mixed emotions when it comes to my thoughts on this book. There really was so much here to like and enjoy and engage with, and I genuinely enjoyed reading it overall. I really loved diving headfirst into the mirror world and really analysing and taking a good look at people like Steve Bannon and Naomi Wolf and their influence on American culture and the world at large, how they talk about the things that they do, how they connect to people and their fears. But I also felt like there was quite a bit that was lacking in this book, or places where I didn't really feel like Naomi Klein went far enough in her analysis, or places where it almost felt like, at least from my perspective, she was kind of like misdirecting her attention a little bit. So an interesting book, but not a great one, in my opinion. Then I have, I think, just 3 books that I have not yet spoken about on the channel, 2 of which were young adult books. One was kind of like one of my most anticipated books of the month that was coming out, and it was A Tempest of Tea. This is actually a pretty short fantasy young adult book, and it's historical fantasy. We know how historical fantasy is kind of my thing, and I haven't been reading enough of it this year. I was really excited about this one, and I did like quite a lot about it, but I didn't love it. If I'm being entirely honest with you, this was a little disappointing to me. It felt a little mediocre. Essentially, in this book we meet Arthi, who's our main character, and she runs with her friend a tea house, and it's like a regular tea house by day, but at night it's a blood house where vampires come to feast. I really liked the setup. I really enjoyed the writing and the atmosphere. I'd say they were my 2 favorite parts of this book. However, there were elements of the storytelling and the characters and the setup that just never really felt fully fleshed out by the end. Things like Arthi basically being a bit of like a reimagination of King Arthur just felt a little gimmicky and half-assed to me. But I'd say my biggest issue with this was the romance, the romantic like triangle sort of thing that was happening. I just didn't like it. It felt very forced and overdone in a lot of areas to me, and I just didn't really buy the romantic attraction, and angst was just such a big part of this book, which I know some people love. I do not. So it's definitely a book that I will happily recommend at work. I'm sure there are plenty of people who will adore this, and I liked it, but I would not say that I loved it. The other young adult book I read was a contemporary romance. It's called Something More by Jaclyn, and this book I feel very conflicted about, if I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I found this at once one of the most relatable and engaging young adult books and young adult protagonists that I've ever read. And at the same time, there were so many parts that I found infuriating and so frustrating. In this book, we meet 15-year-old Jessie. She's Palestinian Canadian, and she's just about to start high school. And she has just been diagnosed autistic. So she is processing a lot while also just dealing with starting at a new school, trying to make new friends, trying to fit in, all of that good stuff. This is another love triangle romance, which is not my favorite trope, and I did find elements of it frustrating. The other thing that I found frustrating had a lot to do with the female friendship and dynamics in here. And while I found a lot of it very frustrating, in a lot of ways, those were the same things that I found relatable. So part of me was kind of feeling like getting on my moral high horse and telling you all about how like the toxicity in this female friendship group, especially in the first half of the book, was like fueled by internalized misogyny and so unnecessary and had pick-me-girl energy and all of this. And that is true. And yet, as somebody who has just recently been diagnosed autistic and looking back on my female friendships in school and in high school, like, no, I didn't love a lot of this depiction, but oh my god, did I find it fucking relatable. The romantic stuff I didn't find relatable at all. To be perfectly honest, I was not that interested in romance until like the end of high school. So the boy obsession that so many of the girls have in here, I didn't find relatable and kind of was a bit overdone for me, but like whatever. So yeah, I'm left kind of like hating and loving this book all at once. And like maybe that's kind of part of its charm. It's one of those books where the representation feels deliberately not perfect. Jessie is not the perfect autistic character. She's not the perfect Palestinian character. She's messy and uncertain, and she's figuring stuff out as she goes along. It was kind of corny. It was overdone. The way that all of these girls are just so boy crazy. I could go on and on. There are so many things in here that I think are like valid critiques, but at the end of the day, I just kind of ate it up. And then finally, the last book we have to talk about, the last book that I read this month was my Blossom Book Club book for March. That's my Patreon book club. Together we read Loving Country, A Guide to Sacred Australia by Bruce Pascoe and Vicky Shakuroglu. And this is basically a travel guide to Indigenous Australia. This beautiful hardcover book is filled to the brim with just absolutely beautiful photos from all around the country. And basically Bruce and Vicky take turns talking to you about different regions, different places in Australia, different cultural and otherwise important Indigenous sites that you can visit, giving you a little bit of history on the area, both in terms of like Indigenous history of like 120,000 years, but also on like recent history and colonization and the effects of colonization in the area. At the end of each section, you get some important information about the area and then specifically some particular sites and places that you might like to visit and see. Again, with an emphasis on Indigenous experiences. This is just such a thoughtful, well put together book, and the audiobook's amazing too. Bruce and Vicky narrate it themselves. I really enjoyed reading this. I loved getting to know about areas that I'm familiar with, like Tilba and Narooma, places that I've been to visit my grandparents in Bateman's Bay, areas in central New South Wales where I was born, places in Queensland, North Queensland, where I lived for a long time, places in Victoria, but also plenty of places in lots of other parts of Australia that I've never been to before. I feel like this is just one of those books that I will keep forever and that I will reference whenever I'm traveling. But even when I'm not traveling, right here where I live now, I think this book is such a great reminder of the living, breathing culture that continues to exist right where I am now. And I feel like this book, along with so much of Bruce Pascoe's work, is basically an invitation to settlers like me to truly become Australian, like actually become part of this land and this country by actively embracing it rather than resisting it and holding on to settler colonial ideas and behaviors and ways of being. So a beautiful book that I highly recommend. Again, if you can get the physical book, I mean, I would, because the pictures are just amazing in this, but the audiobook was great too. So that is everything that I read in March. Now let's have a little bit of a chat, a brief chat about what I've got planned for April. As a reminder, I'm a mood reader and I definitely like to switch things up. I don't like to be too locked into a plan. So I'm not going to tell you everything that I have planned, and even the things that I tell you may change, but I do have some books currently in mind that I would like to prioritize in April. The first book is honestly the only absolute certainty, and that is Beyond Survival. This is my Blossom Book Club's book for April. This is a non-fiction anthology and it's strategies and stories from the transformative justice movement. I'm really looking forward to this one, cannot wait. Then I do want to get stuck into the second book in the Tiffany Aching series by Terry Pratchett. This is A Hat Full of Sky. I've got it here. I've got the audiobook from my library, so I think it's going to happen. Then a proof that I picked up from work that I do want to try and get to this month is I Hope This Doesn't Find You by Anne Lang. I don't know a lot about this, but it's her latest young adult romance release, so if I can get to it, I would like to. Then I have two books that have something very particular in common that I'm hoping to do a reading vlog for. The first is Orbital by Samantha Harvey, and the second, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but I'm gonna guess it's Edenglassie by Melissa Lukashenko. I think this is like a mashup of Edinburgh and Glasgow, because originally I think Brisbane was going to be called this instead. Both of these books are the kind of books that would usually be shelved by bookstores in like general fiction, literary fiction, but they're both also kind of sci-fi. So I'm looking forward to them. And then finally, I'm going to be reading one of these three books, just one. Basically, I really want my next read, which will be my 50th book of the year, to be a 5-star. And I'm convinced one of these three could be it. And right now, as I'm filming, I have a poll up for you to vote over on my community tab. By the time you're seeing this, I will have already selected the winner. So I'm hoping to do a reading vlog of one of these three selected by you, which if it goes well, you will be seeing soon. So those three books are Siren Queen by Nevo, Lonely Castle in the Mirror, which I've had on my shelf for ages now, and Mrs. Death, Mrs. Death. So again, I'm just going to be reading one of these three books because I'm convinced that in here somewhere is a 5-star. But I think that about does it for our March-April reset. Thank you so much for hanging out with me and chatting books. A big thank you as always to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you goes to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. And thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments below what you've been reading in March, what you hope to read in April, and I will talk to you soon. Until then, happy reading. Bye!